Hi, this is Andy Scarborough with Crownworks. Last week we talked a little bit about some of the challenges around asking for what we want. This week it's all about the aftermath. What do we do when we get it? Sometimes receiving our heart's desire can be just as challenging and just as tricky. Whether it is that new client or a great review, or a lover, or an apartment, or anything that we dare to name and ask for, somehow when it shows up in our lap, we can't help but slay ourselves. And there is a method to that madness, and we're going to talk a bit about it today. So asking and receiving, it's a two-part game. And maybe we're really good at one side of it, but we're not so great at the other. So when we ask for what we want, we're really putting ourselves in a vulnerable position of expressing a need and allowing somebody else the gift of providing that for us. And we know how biochemically that feels so good to assist someone else. So here's the catch. How do we catch that gift as it's being thrown to us, right? There's an art to the receiving as well. Some challenges with receiving may look like being really uncomfortable with a compliment, deflecting praise, or even just refusing to let somebody help you carry your groceries to your car. There are lots of ways we get in our own way from receiving what we want, and I've come to understand them as upper limits problems. As I shared in my last video, one of the anti-asking sort of tactics is to do it your damn self, right? And I've always prided myself on being independent and self-sufficient and self-made, and that means I don't need help from anyone. And when I do need help, often there's a big hang-up about what that means, right? So I shared a little bit in the asking video about how I used to have a story about asking denoting a weakness or a neediness or a vulnerability. I became really aware that there was also a story about debt, right? Like if I received a kindness from someone, then I owed them something. And you might think about this, especially as, the holidays are coming around, right? Like you're always so cautious about gift giving. You want to make sure that you give someone, or at least I always did, want to make sure that I gave someone a gift that was equal or greater value to what I was being given. And there was an idea about kindness having a debt to it. And it makes it really difficult to receive that, right? As I became more aware that this is something that was happening in my life, I started to look at the ways that I was saying no to receiving kindness in all sorts of little, like apparently innocuous situations. And one of them that really stood out to me was at the pet food store. So I have 3 animals who are totally spoiled and eat way better than I do. And I go to a pet food store where the staff is amazing and kind and present and knowledgeable, and I love it, and that's why I go there. And so every time I go, I'm buying a giant bag of food and 2 or 3 flats of cat food, and all manner of spoils and toys and whatever else treats they need. So I'm like the girl walking up to the cash register, like this, because I just needed the one thing when I walked in. And I remember being in the aisle one night and the guy coming up to me and saying, "Oh, can I just take that for you and take it to the register?" And I thought, "Oh, well, yeah, that'd be great, thanks." And so he took it and set it down up there. And then when I got up there, I thanked him 2 or 3 times for sort of coming to my rescue in the aisle. And he finally looked at me and he said, "Yeah, I'm just doing my job." And I thought, "Oh, right, that's his job to help me. That's great." And he asked me if he could carry the dog food to my car. And I was quiet for a really, I'm sure, long, uncomfortable moment as I really thought about this and thought, oh, this is one of those moments, right? This is one of those opportunities where I get to just say yes. And it was the strangest, most wonderful little moment, because in that moment I made an agreement with myself that anytime someone offered me something like that, I was just going to run what I called the yes experiment, right? Just say yes to help and see what happens. And so I looked at him and, so proud of myself, said, yes, you can help me to my car with my dog food. And he looked at me like, oh, okay, crazy lady, like, I will take this out for you, no problem. And I got in my car and I felt awful. I felt really weird. But it was unusual. It was a muscle that I hadn't stretched before. And so it made sense that this was going to be a little uncomfortable at first. And what I learned is that the discomfort actually is a sign of growth. So that was my yes experiment about asking for help. I highly recommend it. It will make you really uncomfortable, but it's also amazing and really freeing. And you start looking for ways that you can say yes to help in other ways of your life. I don't know. In my opinion, as a woman, like, it's difficult. You know, we've had this conflicting story about being strong, independent women, and also, you know, being gracious and soft and feminine. And that receiving bit is sometimes tricky. So how do we receive with strength without the perception of debt? And that is just, it's a practice. It's just a practice like anything else. Another way that I learned to practice was in taking compliments. And that I learned from watching the red carpet, believe it or not. I got sort of scolded by a dear friend one day for not being able to take a compliment. I had this real fun flair for vintage dresses for a long time. And part of it, to be totally honest, was an insecurity about moving to LA and not being able to afford the right names or brands of clothes to wear to these events. So I felt like if I could just say, oh, it's vintage, that was kind of a loophole that I would navigate through to avoid doing it wrong in the very posh LA fashion world. So when someone would compliment my outfit, I would be so quick to dismiss it. Like, oh, I got it for $1 at Jet Rag, or, oh, look, you know, it's got hair color on here. I could never just say, thank you. Just thank you. And I realized at one point, hearing myself go on and on dismissing this dress that I knew that I had spent 3 hours scavenging for and had also replaced all of the buttons and done a bunch of work to make it even cuter and more my own. I was very uncomfortable with someone giving me praise. And I realized that there was a really old story for me about humility, about how you don't want to ever be braggy. And so even when someone else is saying nice things about you, it makes it really hard to receive that and feel gracious about it. So there was a time in my life where I was writing a lot of how-to tutorials for up styles, like red carpet styles. And so I would watch pretty much only the pregame show on a lot of the awards ceremonies just to check out what was happening on the red carpet, and then I would do like a how-to about it. And I remember one year watching, it was Gwyneth Paltrow on the red carpet, and I thought, wow, you know, here she is walking down and all these reporters are just giving her this same like glowing, dripping, honey-covered praise about how stunning she is. And she's stunning, and her dress was impeccable. And I thought, if that were me, I wouldn't know how to respond to that. I would feel a little overwhelmed or embarrassed, or maybe okay for the first couple, but then after that it would get sort of weird. And so I stopped what I was doing and I just watched. And I realized that she had a couple of responses, and one of them was really simple. Someone would say something to her and she would just say, "Thank you, that's very kind." And that's it. I swear it was the most freeing statement I'd ever heard. As hairdressers, we get confronted with that little mini red carpet moment probably at least 4 or 5 times a day. You know, someone at the end of their appointment is talking about how much they love it, how great we are, and after a while that can kind of sink in and we stop hearing it, right? We stop hearing that we really made someone's day. And we wind up deflecting or going, oh no, you know, it's not a big deal, or oh, whatever. And really, I think that there's something to be said about just stopping in that moment and taking a hint from Gwen on the red carpet, right? Thank you. That's very kind. Or if you want to take it even a step farther, Thank you. I really appreciate that you recognize how many hours I've spent training on my blow dry skills. Or, thank you. I appreciate that you're seeing how my dedication to my continued education is showing. There's an interesting brain fact about how we process and store negative versus positive information. Now, it's a really primal part of our brain that has a negative experience and goes, oh, I need to remember that immediately, right? Like there's a lion in the brush out there. So when we have negative feedback, it takes about 1 second to store that information for future reference, so that if we're in that situation again, we anticipate that negative experience. Now, on the other hand, for us to really store a positive piece of feedback, like a compliment, it takes 15 to 17 seconds to hold that in the brain and really have it be stored there. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, the truth is, though, it makes sense, right? A positive experience, a compliment per se, isn't going to be as necessary to store for the brain or as easy to access as something that may indicate our survival. And anything that challenges us or raises that cortisol, that stress hormone in the body, is just going to be stored faster. So all the more reason for us to really take a compliment and taking a compliment as a serious practice. We literally can rewire our brains to have more immediate positive experiences if we're taking the time to store those as they come in, rather than anticipating somebody's going to say something negative, which blocks us from asking, right? We're anticipating the no. Now suddenly we've filled our brain with such a repertoire of positive experiences that we're always expecting the yes. And if we were running an expectant yes experiment, what might show up there? What might we not even have to ask for? So I want to share with you one of the most impactful books that I read this year on the subject of receiving, and that's called The Big Leap. Now here, Hendricks refers to that receiving block as upper limits problems. And this again is totally relative to us beyond asking for help or receiving compliments. Also how we restrict ourselves by some real limiting beliefs, like old childhood-based fears about outshining someone or leaving someone behind, and how to really dismantle those and how those show up. You know, have you ever gotten a great promotion or met what you thought was your soulmate and then sort of screwed it up somehow? Had an amazing interview and then overslept? Or did something subconsciously that sort of slays the experience of receiving for yourself? So in this book, Hendricks talks about something referred to as kind of an emotional thermostat. And I think that that's, when I read it, it really resonated for me that that's what I was hitting in places like the pet food store or in receiving a compliment on a vintage dress. There was some upper limits problem that I was encountering in the belief that I couldn't have that kind of kindness to me without consequence. And that is really the number one reason that we don't receive, is that we feel like there will be some consequence to having this thing that we've always wanted. And that's how we manage things when we haven't really taught ourselves how to receive. We haven't reset that emotional thermostat. So if it's the man or woman of our dreams that shows up and we wind up sort of sabotaging something there, or if it's the client that shows up that we wind up being late for or being unprofessional, there's some element of us that's afraid to live into our wildest dreams. Because what happens if we do? You know, it sounds like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? Like, what happened to the little boy who suddenly got everything he wanted? Oh, he lives happily ever after. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean to get everything that we want? And what then? And do we dare to ask? And how dare we want to live beyond the financial parameters that our parents experienced? You know, that's another way that this shows up in a really big way. We take we take what our parents made as income, and there's a part of us that really hits a strong, I mean, this is across all industry, like a frequent place that people hit an upper limits wall, is in the fear of what it will mean to make more than their parents. And of course your parents would want you to do well, but there's an idea of how dare I, and what does it mean? And so suddenly we're out in uncharted waters. And the only way that we can really navigate that is to be aware of how we sabotage ourselves, and to practice a lot of what I'm going to talk about in my next video, which is gratitude. Gratitude is the solution. But we'll talk some more about gratitude in the next video, because that is a practice too. As the asking and receiving, whew, that is just the beginning. Thanks for joining me today here on Crownworks. If you liked what you see, don't forget to hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram at crown_works. You can find me through the hashtag Crownworks as well. And if you have ideas or conversations that you'd like to have, feel free to send me a private message on Instagram, comment below, or you can reach me on email at crownworks7@gmail.com. And for those of you that have been joining me here since the beginning, thank you. That's very kind. Till next time, crown on.